Hello, folks. This is Joseph Holbrook, professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Florida International University. We're coming to the end of our series on the Caribbean. We've been using Franklin Knight's excellent book about the Caribbean, the genesis of a fragmented nationalism, as a guide through this survey or journey that we've taken. I gave pretty detailed lectures on each of the chapters in the first half of the book, but now in the second half, Franklin Knight, who is a historian from Jamaica, he changes his focus from the development of the social structures in the Caribbean, in which he posits a settler society versus a exploitive society, basically plantation economies, as his explanatory variable, using ideal types to show why the islands are so different from one another. And in the second half, he shifts his focus to nation building and the challenges and obstacles that lay in the path of each of the major islands in their attempt to build modern nations and develop a cohesive sense of national identity. He has three chapters, chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, that are devoted to case studies of the various different language groups within the Caribbean that attempted to become independent, strong, independent, sovereign nation states in the 20th century. I'm going to give a quick overview of the four. I'm not going to go in detail for each one. You can read them in his book. But I think it's a great overview to show some of the difficulties that the island nations have had on their pathway to nationhood. His first chapter deals with Cuba, which I have studied quite a bit in my history training years. And he shows how Cuba in the 19th century was unique in the Latin American or Spanish American world. There were some stirrings in the early 1800s towards sentiments of independence, but they were quickly quashed by the Spanish Empire, the Spanish government. There was a number of reasons for that. One of them was that there was a strong traumatized fear among the planter class in Cuba that Cuba would become another case like Haiti, in which an attempt to become independent, as the French did, the white French colonial overmasters in Haiti during the French Revolution, that created a rebellion among the free people of color, as well as the slaves who were either African or Creoles. Creoles meaning they were born in Saint-Domingue and not in Africa. Because of the destruction of the Haitian Revolution and the terrible brutality that ensued, and the complete destruction of the sugar planting industry of the French in Saint-Domingue, many of them took their slaves and their holdings and left Haiti and went to eastern Cuba, particularly Santiago de Cuba, and they spread stories about, terrifying stories about the Haitian Revolution. And the Cuban slave owners and plantation owners were terrified that if they separated from Spain, that their slave population would rise up against them. Cuba was never a exploitation colony to the same extent as the French Saint-Domingue. In Saint-Domingue, there was about 30,000 white French plantation owners and over 450,000, almost 500,000 slaves, black slaves, working under their control, with about 40,000 free people of color or mulattoes. And so that was a classic example of Franklin Knight's ideal type of an exploitation society, which you have a division in the society based on ethnic lines or skin color, and a small number of people control a vast number of slaves. After the initial colonization of Cuba, in which the Taino Indians were genocidally destroyed, after that, Cuba became a settler society, with Spanish settlers moving there becoming craftsmen, tradesmen, small landowners, agriculturalists. They raised cattle and crops, and they became the food basket for Spanish domains, particularly in Mexico, in which they exported those agricultural products to Mexico. They also later developed a shipbuilding industry in Havana, and so it was much more of a classic, although not completely a settler society. It was much more a settler society than other islands were, until the 19th century, when the sugar boom happened in Cuba, and they began to import a lot more African slaves. They increased their slave population, although the slave population never reached the majority in Cuba. There was always a majority of free whites and free people of color in Cuba, even up to the abolition of slavery in 1889, I believe it was. And so the Cubans were terrified of separating themselves from the Spanish Empire. Also, during the wars with Simón Bolívar in Spanish America, Spain fortified Cuba with Spanish troops. It became basically a large military garrison, and a large number of the population were involved in the Spanish military, plus a large number of Spaniards lived in Cuba. And so the Spanish military, the Spanish Empire, had a death grip on Cuba throughout the 19th century. That does not mean to say that the Cubans didn't attempt to seek their independence from Spain. There was a 10-year war launched in 1868, called, appropriately enough, the 10 Years' War, that ended in a stalemate and a frustrated postponement of independence for Cuba. There was also several attempts by filibusterers or freebooters, mercenaries, to invade Cuba and take it over. This is in the period leading up to the American Civil War. Narciso Lopez was one. I believe he was a Venezuelan freebooter who attempted to invade Cuba and separate it from Spain and make it into a dependency of the United States and possibly a slave state. A lot of the southern states were interested in acquiring Nicaragua or Cuba or the Dominican Republic prior to the American Revolution to tilt the balance politically in the Senate, in the United States Senate, towards slave-owning states by adding new states that were slave-owning. Those came to naught, and in the 10 Years' War in 1868, Jose Marti was a 15-year-old teenager who got in trouble for writing some essays or tracts in favor of Cuban independence, and he was exiled to Spain and imprisoned. From there, he escaped and made his way to New York and became a journalist and a writer and a thinker, and the apostle of Cuban independence, as he's been called. And while in New York, he also visited Tampa and Key West and began to rally Cuban exile populations around the idea of achieving independence from Spain. This also had some implications for church, religious life in Cuba, because the overwhelming majority of Spanish priests were Spaniards, and they were very conservative and tended to favor the Spanish Empire and oppose the attempts at independence for Cuba. Here's my friend Smoke is going to help me with this presentation here, my loyal cat. And so Cuba, for a number of good reasons, was unable to break away from Spain and achieve its independence until it launched another war of independence under the inspiration of Jose Marti in 1895. Unfortunately, Jose Marti went into battle. In the very first battle, he was killed, thus becoming a martyr to Cuban independence. And they fought a pitched and brutal war with Spanish troops from 1895 until 1898, I believe it was, when the American public the American public began to feel sympathetic with the Cubans. The American Yellow Press, Randolph Hearst and others, played the war drums and whipped up public support for Cuban independence. And then I think it was in February of 1898, the U.S. warship exploded. It probably was an accident, but the blame was placed on Spain, and President William McKinley declared war on Spain and entered into the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which they sent troops to Cuba, which totally eclipsed the Cuban efforts to win their own independence. And the independence was basically quickly won, or not independence, I should say that differently. Separation of Cuba from Spain was quickly won by victory of the American troops in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and eventually in the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt had a fairly large role to play in that. He was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was the Assistant Secretary of Navy, and the Secretary of the Navy was out of Washington when this broke out, and so he quickly sent a cable to, I think it was Thomas Dewey, the admiral in the Pacific Fleet, to take Manila, which they did forthwith. And then he organized the Rough Riders and went with them to fight in Cuba in what he called a splendid little war. There's a lot I could go into with that, but that was basically the moment that the United States went from being a developing nation to being conscious of its own potential for empire. And so eventually the American troops landed not only in the Philippines and in Cuba, but also in Puerto Rico. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. While in Cuba, there was a strong racial element among the American troops. The Marines, the commanding officers, were very conscious of the ethnic differences with Cubans, and they tended to favor white elite Cubans over the black and mulatto soldiers who had fought for Cuban independence in the 10 Years' War, and then again from 1895 through 1898. So when they finally were able to convene a constitutional assembly, the dark Cubans, the Cubans of color, were excluded from Havana and excluded from the political process. The American ambassador insisted that the Cuban Constitutional Assembly insert a plank in its constitution called the Platt Amendment, which guaranteed the United States the legal right to intervene in Cuba anytime there was a disturbance or a problem, which it did several times later in the 20th century. And this rankled the Cuban patriots, especially those of color, who had fought and bled, and in many cases given their lives for Cuban independence, to find that they were no longer dependent upon Spain. They were dependent upon the United States, and they were a subject state. The United States did not attempt to make Cuba into a territory or a colony like they did with Puerto Rico, for the simple reason that all the press in the United States had talked up the idea of Cuban independence, and it would then be embarrassing to reveal their cards and show that they had no intention of letting Cuba be independent to the American public, and so they disguised it behind the Platt Amendment. A number of factors led to a number of corrupt regimes and corrupt politicians, partly the fact that Cubans could not compete economically with American corporations and interests that were buying up the land and investing in sugar production. And so Cuba became pretty much a corrupt system, a mafiocracy, through the 40s and 50s. They did have a very liberal constitution in 1940 that, if it had been followed, would have been one of the most liberal constitutions, but that wasn't followed. Fulgencio Batista rose to power in the 1930s and became more or less the mafia boss of Cuba. As many of you know, if you know much about Cuban history, Havana and Cuba became a safe haven for mafiosos, and there was just a lot of corruption in Cuba leading up to the 1950s, when along came Fidel Castro and the July 16th movement, which initially was not communist or Marxist. It was a freedom movement against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Many committed Catholic students and even evangelical students went to the Sierra Maestra and fought with the July 16th movement to win independence for Cuba from Fulgencio Batista and return it to a constitutional democracy or republic. Many of them thinking that they would return to the 1840 Constitution as a pluralist constitution, and then were bitterly deceived when Fidel Castro, and there's great debate on whether he was hiding his cards or whether he generally shifted his position, but Fidel Castro increasingly moved towards the Soviet Union as a counterbalance against the power of the United States. I won't take time to talk about Guatemala in 1954, but the example of what the CIA did in Guatemala in 1954 was a warning and a lesson to the Cuban revolutionaries that if they tried to go with just reforms that they might get invaded and overtaken, which did indeed almost happen with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which then further strengthened the Castro regime in a crackdown against the church and against any institutions in civil society that could resist the Revolutionary Party. And so, as you see, in the 19th century, Cuba was a dependent of Spain, and it went from that to being a dependent of the United States, and then in the Cuban Revolution, it moved away from the United States rather brusquely and became a dependent of the Soviet Union. And in more recent years, it's been dependent on Venezuelan oil. So Cuba has never been able to stand on its own economically as a viable, sustainable path to a modern nation state. There's a lot that could be said about the development of a Cuban national identity. Things with Afro-Cuban music and dance, salsa, son. There have been books written and studies about how these have incorporated the Afro-Cubans into the sense of national identity. And indeed, if you talk to many Cubans, they will say that there is no consciousness of race for Cubans, that whether you're black or white or brown, that all are Cuban. Other scholars have contested that and believe that dismisses a lot of real prejudice that still exists through the Cuban Revolution. Moving on to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was quite different than Cuba. This is chapter 8 of Franklin Knight's book. He discusses the history of Puerto Rico. It was a backwater. It was overlooked in the Spanish Empire, with only a handful of colonists living there, living mostly from cattle raising and peasant subsistence agriculture. And it was not the military base that Cuba was, or the staging area for the Spanish military. It didn't have the shipbuilding capabilities that Havana had, and so it was overlooked quite a bit. And it was not until, and again, it fit Franklin Knight's ideal type of a settler society on a smaller scale. Again, in Puerto Rico, black slaves were never more than half of the population, and usually quite less, maybe 30% of the population. Unlike Saint-Domingue, the French Saint-Domingue, for example. And so, in the 19th century, there was a sentiment towards independence amongst many Puerto Ricans. There was also an early push to end slavery in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has their leaders that are the equivalent of Jose Marti for Cuba. They have leaders. They had leaders in the 19th century that served that role for Puerto Rico. They continually negotiated with the Spanish government for greater autonomy. Many of the leaders in Puerto Rico would have been very happy with a Estado Asociado Libre, a autonomous state within the Spanish system, somewhat like Canada is with Great Britain, perhaps. And there was an attempt in 1868, the Grito de Lares, to raise a rebellion against Spain, which failed. very quickly. But the Puerto Ricans had greater success with the Spanish governing authorities in negotiating the possibility of autonomy within a Spanish system. And actually, they had worked out all the details by 1897, and it was supposed to begin in May of 1898. The Puerto Rico was supposed to become self-governing, associated with Spain. It happened to be the same month that American troops landed in Puerto Rico and immediately put an end to these attempts at Puerto Rican autonomy. And into the 20th century, you had three different parties that eventually emerged, three different points of view. One that wanted to become a 51st state of the United States, one that wanted to maintain its status as a associated free state within the United States system, and one that wanted complete independence from the United States. In fact, in the 1950s, I believe there was some freedom fighter or / terrorist activity by the third group that I believe they attempted to assassinate Harry Truman. I'm a little fuzzy on the details because I'm not going in detail here. I'm trying to give you the broad sketches. One of the most successful politicians in Puerto Rican history was Luis Munoz. I just forgot his last name. It wasn't Rivera. Rivera was his father. Luis Munoz Marin. And he was the son of another successful politician. And he, I should back up for a second and say that when American troops arrived in 1898, their plan for in the early part of the 20th century was to eradicate the Spanish heritage, eliminate Spanish, and promote the education of English, and to make Puerto Rico into something resembling California or Texas or New Mexico, a more or less an Anglo-Saxon dependency, and eventually a state associated with the United States. A lot of Puerto Ricans resented that attempt to wipe out their culture, and they resisted and maintained their Spanish and their sense of being Hispanic. That's an interesting topic for further research, I think. And so, but in 1917, Puerto Rico successfully negotiated with the United States to become American citizens, and they achieved a status of being a colony or a territory of the United States, but having some degree of limited autonomy. And so they became citizens and had the right then to immigrate to the United States. They were very clearly second-class citizens, and they actually served as surplus labor in the United States as they immigrated massively to New York and then later to Florida. We have had more recent immigration from Puerto Rico to Orlando and even in South Florida. But because of their unique background and the fact that they were out of the spotlight and were somewhat of a backwater, they didn't have the numerous attempts to fight for their independence that Cuba did. So you see, Cuba went from Spanish overlordship to the United States and then to the Soviet Union, and you could argue to Venezuela. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, ended up becoming firmly ensconced in the American orbit and dependent upon the United States. It has had some financial benefit from that compared to some of the other Caribbean states. There was a initiative launched partly by Luis Munoz Marin in the 1940s through 1968 called Operation Bootstrap that attempted to encourage companies to open up manufacturing facilities, pharmaceutical facilities in Puerto Rico, and there was a definite increase in jobs and income, although not much of a decrease of unemployment because of the high Puerto Rican birth rate, thus leading to the need for large numbers of immigrants to leave the island. So Cuba ends up with the Soviet Union and Venezuela in somewhat of an economic mess today. Puerto Rico is more stable economically, but is dependent upon the United States. His third case study is the island of Hispaniola, which today constitutes two independent republics, the Republic of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is still Spanish-speaking. And those two islands, those two nations have developed side by side on the same island. I highly recommend a book by C.L.R. James called Toussaint Louverture and the San Domingo Revolution. If you want to get insight into the Haitian Revolution, I can't think of a better resource. And C.L.R. James observes that the violence and brutality of the recently freed African slaves that fought in Toussaint Louverture's army, their brutality and their violence was paled in comparison to the violence they suffered at the hands of the white sugar planters and slave owners prior to that. And he shows that they were disciplined, fierce fighters, courageous under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, who was truly one of the great leaders in the Americas, certainly in Latin America, who rose from slavery to be the leader of the military leader of the troops of Haiti, and also the liberator of Haiti and its first president, you would say. Let me pause this because it's starting to rain. So C.L.R. James, because of the attempts to put the slaves back in slavery, the former slaves, the released slaves, who released themselves through a military action, an insurrection, there were attempts to put them back into slavery by the British, the Spanish, and the French twice. Sent armies to invade Haiti and to subjugate the revolting Creole and African slaves under Toussaint Louverture. It's an amazing story of how they beat off the French twice with armies of over 70,000 men. They fought the British for 6 years, the British Empire, and kept 80,000 British sailors and soldiers tied down in Haiti that could have been fighting Napoleon in Europe. And at one point or another, they had to fight off the Spanish Empire coming from the eastern side of the island. It's truly an amazing and unique and heroic tale of the only successful slave rebellion in history. And Toussaint Louverture has been called the Black Spartacus. He's been compared to Simon Bolivar or George Washington. I highly encourage you to read about his life. But one of the comments that C.L.R. James makes is that the slaves were so unwilling to have slavery reimposed upon them that they were willing to burn down the entire economic structure, if necessary, so that the European empires would lose interest, because there was no longer any great wealth to gain. In 1791, Saint-Domingue, which is present-day Haiti, was the wealthiest colony in the Americas, with its annual sugar production. But by 1804, that sugar industry had been pretty much destroyed in the attempts to win their freedom. And they were more committed to their freedom than they were to having economic wealth. I'll just put it that way. It was so destructive, fighting with three empires and fighting from 1790 through about 1804 to win their freedom, that can help one understand why Haiti is partly in the situation it's in today. I'll talk more about that in a moment. It's important to note that Simon Bolivar, after he bankrupted his own fortune and was run out of Colombia and Venezuela, went to Jamaica, where he wrote the famous letter from Jamaica, and from there he went to Haiti, and André Pétion, who was the president of the Southern Republic, the Mulatto Republic in southern Haiti, gave him 3 ships, soldiers, weapons, and a large amount of cash to go back to continue the fight against the Spanish in Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru. All he asked them was that he would declare an end to slavery. Okay, I moved inside so that I could continue this without the background noise of the rain. There's little feeder bands coming through here in spurts. So they finally achieved their independence in 1804, became an independent country. One writer and traveler who traveled to Haiti in the early 19th century described it as one of the most stable and peaceful places that he had been to in the Americas, with the least amount of crime and the most public security. That certainly is a big change from today. And a lot of that can be explained by the military occupations of Haiti by the U.S. Marines in the early part of the 20th century in a policy known as gunboat diplomacy, which happened in not only in Haiti but also in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic, as well as other places. And a great deal of racism on the part of the occupying American troops and their officers. And so the American Marines were in Haiti for 16 years. I don't know the exact begin and ending dates, but in a pattern that developed also in Nicaragua and also in the Dominican Republic. They they created a National Guard and built up the National Guard to be a peacemaking and occupying force. And it was Papa Doc Duvalier who eventually took control of the National Guard in Haiti and became a brutal dictator of Haiti. And all of these regimes that arose after American military occupation could be called mafiocracies. Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. What was the guy's name in the Dominican Republic? Rafael Trujillo and Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti ran the countries as their personal fiefdoms and for their own personal aggrandizement. And this pretty much destroyed any kind of democratic norms that could have prevailed in Haiti. Also, I should also mention that in the 19th century, France imposed a $20 billion war reparations bill on Haiti and forced it to begin to repay. The United States withheld recognition of the new Republic of Haiti in 1804 until after the Civil War, 1865, for obvious reasons. The South of the United States would not have tolerated recognizing a black independent republic not far from the shores of the southern United States. Also, the Vatican withheld recognition of Haiti as a sovereign state for at least 60 years. And so one might sum that up and say that these world empires, the British, the French, the Spanish, and then later on the United States, were offended and embarrassed that this group of recently freed slaves were able to defeat them over a 20-year period in fighting for their independence, and was determined to punish them. Throughout the 19th century and on into the 20th century, and there had been a series of missteps of American foreign policy and problems that have led to a deteriorating situation that we have certainly contributed a lion's share portion of. In which case, I think we have some responsibility to address some of the solutions. I'm not going to go into the history of San Domingo or the Dominican Republic, although it's quite fascinating. At one point, they asked the United States to adopt them as a state in the Union. They tried to go back under Spain. They had difficulties maintaining their independence from Haiti. They were occupied by Haiti until 1844. And this has generated a tremendous amount of racism between brown or dark-skinned Dominicans against black Haitians. It's a very unusual situation on the island. There's a documentary about this that you can watch on YouTube called Island Divided. And once again, Haiti, although it was the first island nation to win its independence in 1804, Cuba didn't win its independence ostensibly, quote unquote, until 1898 or 1900. And most of the rest of the Caribbean nations didn't become independent until the middle of the 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados were becoming independent. So Haiti started off amazingly with this amazing story, but ended up a basket case because it's not able to be sustainable economically, and because the world powers have done very little to assist it or to make it succeed. The last case study that Franklin Knight does is with the Anglo Caribbean nations. There's a bunch of small ones, but the major ones would be Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados are some of the major ones. You might include Guyana in this, Belize. There was some sentiment in the 1950s about folding them into Canada and letting them become part of Canada as a sovereign nation under the Queen as part of the British Commonwealth of Nations. That fell apart. There was an attempt to, in the late 1950s, to create the West Indian Federation, WIF, and the principal powerhouses of that would have been Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados. And because of the egos of its leaders, and because of the sentiment, national sentiment of island identity, being a Barbadian, a Bajan, as opposed to a Trini from Trinidad or a Jamaican, that pretty much torpedoed any attempt to make the West Indian Federation successful. And it died a natural death, and Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados became independent nations. One thing that did result out of that is they successfully created a university of the West Indies that has campuses in Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica, and functions as one institution, and has been a unifying institution for the Anglo Caribbean. But once again, most of the smaller British islands depend entirely on tourism now for their income. There's not enough employment to sustain their population growth, and it's a very cloudy and troubled future for most of the Anglo Caribbean island nations in the Caribbean. And so I will come back to talk about his last chapter on national development. But all four paths have pretty much ended up in difficulty. The Cuban path, never actually being able to have a sustainable independence. The Puerto Rican path, which is has a mediocre, I don't want to say mediocre, but has a mild prosperity in association with the United States, but second-class citizens. The Haitian example, which has ended up in a lot of tragedy and probably a failed state, and the and the Anglo-Caribbean island nations, some of which are relatively prosperous, like Trinidad has some industry, Jamaica has developed some industry, Barbados is one of the most successful societies and ranks high on the Human Development Index, but a lot of the other islands are very tiny and entirely dependent upon tourism for their income. And so that's a quick overview of Franklin Knight's 4 case studies on national development. I will probably come back with one more video on the last chapter summarizing the national development argument that Knight makes. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.